I'm just going to add this bit on with the lungs. Fairly straightforward with the lungs. The idea being, if I draw a kind of cheapo version of the lungs work on pressure. Okay, that's the key to it. So if I draw my kind of lungs, I'll make them a bit like this. At the bottom we have this this sheet of muscle called the diaphragm, and here would be our windpipe or bronchine, and these are the two lungs. Now what I mean by pressure is, look at this one first. This is breathing out. Okay, so what you're doing when you're breathing out, you're trying to make the lungs smaller. It's like if you squeezed something. If you try and squeeze something that's full of air like a balloon, the harder you squeeze it, the more it tries to push out. You've increased the pressure as you squeeze it. So what you do in here is you try and squeeze, if you like, the lungs, but the air is squeezed out the top, and that's what causes you to breathe out. So you increase the pressure in order to breathe out. Notice the diaphragm has moved up. In fact, what it's done is relaxed, and the lungs are squeezed, if you like, by the action of the muscle between the ribs, the intercostals, and they actually go down and in. Now it's really easy to do, of course. You can even do it in an exam if you're sitting there. If you can't remember what happens when you breathe out, put your hand on your chest and breathe out. You'll feel everything kind of go down and squeeze and get smaller. Okay. Now when it's time to breathe in, we have the opposite happen. In fact, here the diaphragm will contract, opposite to the relaxing, and our intercostals will contract and kind of pull the lungs larger. So doing that lowers the pressure, which sucks or pulls, sorry, air into the lungs. Okay, so I just know the difference between these two things. The idea of it, lower pressure, contracting the diaphragm, contracting the rib muscles, the intercostals, and when you're breathing out, it's the opposite. So this is sometimes also called inspiration, expiration. I think those terms are a little bit confusing for you, but that's what they're called. And finally, just one on alveoli, and this is quite a popular thing for them to ask about. They like it. There's basically four things to remember with alveoli. Alveoli is the plural, by the way. Alveolus is a singular, so if you only got one of them, it's really called an alveolus. These little things that look like, depending how they're drawn, bunches of grapes or a bit of cauliflower maybe, and you know, there's millions and millions of these in your lungs. But the four things you need to remember with them are, they have a large surface area. Okay, because there's so many of them. All right. Anytime you're going to be absorbing things, and we're going to be absorbing oxygen from the air here, anytime you're absorbing something, you want a large surface area. They have a very good actually, blood supply. Lots of capillaries. So there's loads and loads of blood vessels, I'm not showing them on here, really close to these alveoli. They're thin. So if you remember when we talked about capillaries, the capillaries are very thin, they've got very thin walls. The wall of an alveolus is also very, very thin. Why? Well, if it was very thick, it's just a longer distance to move things through, to diffuse through. Whereas if it's very thin, it's just a shorter distance to get through, and it makes it more efficient. And the last one, a different colour, is the ventilation is good. By that I mean that because we're breathing in and out, we bring fresh air in. Now do be careful here, we don't breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide of course, we breathe in air and we breathe out air, but what changes is the proportions of oxygen and carbon dioxide, depending if you're breathing in or out. It's about 21% when you breathe in of oxygen, and it's about 16% when you breathe out, about 0.04 when you breathe in, and about 4% when you breathe out. So you're breathing both of these in, both of these out, but what you're doing is exchanging these gases. Now, this bit is the hardest one to get your head around. This is talking really about concentration gradients, which I mentioned before. Concentration gradient. Remember with diffusion, the idea is you go from a high to a low concentration gradient. So if there's a lot of oxygen in the air as it comes in, but not much oxygen in the blood that's going past, that's a big difference. There's a higher difference from, you know, lots of oxygen to not much oxygen, high to low. Okay, but if we didn't keep refreshing that air, if we just sort of take a deep breath and hold it, as you absorb oxygen into your blood, there's less and less oxygen in the air until eventually you'd get to, well, you'd pass out, so don't do it, but eventually get to a point where the diffusion would stop. So the higher you can keep that gradient, in other words, you keep refreshing the air as it comes into your lungs, and of course getting it out, so you maintain that gradient for carbon dioxide, it becomes more efficient. But those are the four things: large surface area, good blood supply, thin, and good ventilation. And these are all typical things for any kind of surface that is going to absorb something. So for example, your intestines, large surface area, they've got a good blood supply, the walls are thin, ventilation while you're pushing the food through, so you're maintaining that gradient, you know, in that way. So you can think of those as being in general good things to have for absorbing things, but they're specific ones there for the alveoli.